When I started out making dioramas, I used to make little worlds in little boxes. Well, now I've got a bigger box and I'm making a slightly bigger scene, but it's along the same lines. I used to make a lot of waterfalls and I still love making them. This is a moorland stream, based on the kind of streams you get on Dartmoor in England. And once again I'll say thank you to Diorama, Presepe, Noch and the Hot Wire Foam Factory for gifting me their products and materials as featured in this video. I'll see you after this. I had originally intended this piece to not go inside a box, so I started with some big pieces of extruded polystyrene and I cut the river channel into them using the Hot Wire Foam Factory's hand routing tool, using once again my homemade sled, and of course making sure that the area was well ventilated. And I actually pulled the wire through far too quickly, which caused it to lift up and create these lumps and bumps in the base of the channel, which I then had to go and recarve. I then set about widening the river channel after the waterfall. Now I'd cut this section to the right depth, but I realised that I'd cut the section above the waterfall to the wrong depth because it was the same depth as this section, which isn't much good if you're going to have water tumbling down from a height. And because, as I said, this wasn't originally intended to be contained in a box, I thought I'd have to build up the end of the river channels. So I've put this bit of the video in black and white just to show that that wasn't necessary, but that's why you will see it on the pieces going forward. And so when I decided that this would be contained in a box, I realised I'd need to cut it down to size, so I used the Hot Wire Foam Factory's Deluxe 3D table, which makes very light work of a job like this. The box I used was a nice wooden craft box, or storage box. It's designed to store A4 papers, I guess. There was no need to glue the pieces in place. They made a very snug fit, and I'd be using some sculpt mould anyway to build up the landform, so that would secure them in place. And here is the sculpt mould, which I always mix to a relatively thick consistency. This gives you less working time, but it means that the sculpt mould dries before next week. And I just built up the riverbed in the section above the waterfall using scraps of foam and sculpt mould. And then it was just a case of using the sculpt mould to shape the rest of the land. Here I just started creating a little island in the middle of the waterfall. All rock textures and shapes would be added later. I was careful to scrape away and sand off any sculptor mould from the end of the box. This would be harder to remove later once the sculptor mould had dried completely. So now it was on to adding rocks, and for this I'd be using a technique I'd developed for a tutorial that I'd shared on my Patreon page. I do written tutorials there if you want to check them out, and it involved using Woodland Scenics rock moulds and milliput. With the milliput well mixed, you can just press it into sections of the mould and then remove it almost immediately, being very careful not to tear it, and you've got a nice flexible rock which you can mould onto the shape of your landform. It takes a little while for milliput to go off hard, so I made a few rocks ready to go and just started pressing them onto the dry sculptor mould. The sculpting tool came in very handy here for blending the rocks together and for making sure the edges were firmly pressed down. I filled any glaring gaps with little pieces of milliput and then sculpted them using the tool to blend in with the rest of the rocks. You can see I was able to easily fit these rocks to the contours of the land, and that's the advantage this has over, say, plaster rocks, although it is considerably more expensive, of course. In fact, I had a few plaster rocks left over from a previous project, so I used these to create some talus, which I applied to the model using some standard PVA. And to make sure these were firmly fixed in place, I dropped over some scenic glue. And now it was time to give the whole model a base coat. I used a grey primer for this. Make sure you do this in a very well ventilated space, wearing the appropriate mask, obviously. And then I used some homemade black ink wash to highlight and accentuate the rock cracks and fissures. You can see that it was already starting to look more rock-like. But of course they needed some extra depth of colour and tone, so I started with a highlight of Celestra Grey, which I dry brushed over the upper surfaces of the rocks using a makeup brush, being careful not to go too heavy. This wasn't too difficult actually, because I'd left the lid of the Citadel paint pot slightly open by mistake, so the paint had largely dried out. I then used some Griff Charger Grey contrast paint from Citadel, and I applied this over about 3/4 of the rock surface, just going very lightly, partly because I wanted to create a very subtle effect, but partly because it's a very expensive paint. I then moved on to a subtle layer of green wash. This is the Game Wash variety from Vallejo, and the bottle was running out, so it was a very subtle layer indeed. And I ended up using some of their Game Ink black green wash as well, just to create a bit more of a green effect near the water's edge, which I then made slightly more vivid using some yellow Game Ink. I then blended those layers together using a slightly diluted version of my homemade black ink, before applying a final highlight of Rakarth Flesh from Citadel, again very lightly. Did I say final? I didn't mean it. I used some Game Wash Sepia Wash from Vallejo just to add a browner tint to some of the rock surfaces. Not all of them, I wanted to create a kind of patchwork effect. For the kind of mossy earth effect I was looking for, I decided to use some fine turf from Woodland Scenics and to apply this lightly over the base of the rocks using some scenic glue. And then I decided to add yet a further highlight to the rocks using some more Celestra Grey. This generally happens quite a lot with me, and it's usually because the colours look slightly different once all the layers have dried completely. The earth base layer would be dark earth texture from Vallejo. This is a thick acrylic paste, which, as the product name would suggest, creates a really nice earthy texture. Now, a while back I made some self-adhesive static grass tufts using Diorama Presepe's amazing static grass applicator and WWS's tuft glue. I can't remember what static grass I used. I think a lot of it was from Diorama Presepe, some of it was from WWS, some of it was from Noch, and I'm sure there was some Woodland Scenic stuff in there as well. Anyway, I decided to use tufts because basically I wanted a very tufty look, a moorland look, and using an applicator often creates quite a uniform kind of look, unless you're very, very careful to only use spots of glue at a time, and that can take quite a long time overall. So it was just easier to use these tufts, and it also meant I could break off smaller pieces to fit in little gaps. And then I used some Diorama Presepe bushes, which were also made using static grass, to create hillocks or rough patches of taller grass, really. In preparation for pouring the resin, I blended in the ends of the riverbed and banks using some black ink. Well, black ink wash, I should say. And the resin I used was 2-part epoxy resin. This gets mixed in an equal ratio by volume, which is very easy to do. And I tinted it using some transparent glass paint. This is a turquoise, or turquoise as some people call it. And I also used an earth brown, just very small amounts of each, a little goes a long way. And once it had mixed thoroughly and there were no streaks left, that's when I knew that the resin was thoroughly mixed. And I started at the top of the waterfall, so that if any ran down over the edge, I'd know how much I needed to pour into the bottom half of the river. A light misting with isopropyl alcohol burst any bubbles. And then it was on to the water surface, and for this I used some Sudol Fixol crystal clear polymer, which I mixed up into a relatively thin consistency with some isopropyl alcohol, enough so that it flowed but was still workable into ripples. You could also use white spirit for this, but I didn't have any. Luke from Geek Gaming has an excellent tutorial for this technique, so go and check him out. Now I just dripped this mixture over the surface of the dried resin. The resin had taken about 24 hours to cure, and I started working it around with a lolly stick, or a popsicle stick as they call it in the US. And I also used it to start forming the basic shape of the waterfall. Although, as you'll see later, I actually went back and reshaped this. Anyway, to create the ripples, I dabbed at the mixture with a flat-headed brush. You've probably only got about 5 or 10 minutes before this stuff becomes too stiff to work with. One of my favourite products to use at the moment is Foam and Spume from Noch. This stuff goes on white, but it dries to a kind of translucent white with a satiny finish, and it's perfect for creating white water effects. However, at this stage this was a bit of a waste of time because I ended up going back and cutting out a lot of the polymer from this waterfall because I realised I had applied far too much for it to look realistic. Here I go with the knife, what a nightmare. But I'm glad I did it because otherwise the whole piece just wouldn't have looked as I wanted it to look. It is difficult to cut away this polymer, and I ended up tearing a lot of the paint away from the milliput rocks. But what can you do? Well, I'll show you what you can do. The water surface at the top of the waterfall was too low, so I added some more polymer, which contained quite a lot of bubbles surprisingly, which didn't end up looking too bad. I quite like all those bubbles in this water surface. It's a fast flowing river. I wouldn't have done it deliberately, but as it turned out, it looked okay. Then I added some more milliput rocks, and I sculpted these, or I impressed them rather, with some of my leftover plaster cast rocks, and then I painted them using the same technique as before, maybe a slightly truncated version of that. And then of course I went back in with the Noch Foam and Spume to create the flowing waterfall look I was after, and this time I was much happier with how it went. Some more polymer over the dried foam and spume, and then yet more foam and spume over the dried polymer to create a really nice layered, fast flowing waterfall. More foam and spume to create the, well, foam and spume at the base of the waterfall, and then I added some further highlights to the rocks using a little bit of Celestra Grey, followed by some Vallejo moss and lichen. And then just a few more grass tufts. The final stage of the scenery was just adding these Diorama Presepe bushes. This is very similar to Woodland Scenic's fine leaf foliage, but it retains the colour of the natural armature underneath the foam, so I prefer this. Did I say final? I didn't mean it. I added a bit more foam and spume. And then all that was left to do was to paint the box. I used a colour called Lagoon around the scenery itself. It's quite a luxurious colour, I think. And then some chalky finish white furniture paint from Rust-Oleum for the rest. And there you have it, my moorland stream waterfall in a box. I might end up weathering the box itself, a bit like upcycled furniture, which I think would add to the surprise someone would get when they open this apparently plain or even shabby box to find a magical, realistic, natural world inside. Yes, I'm aware that magical, natural and realistic shouldn't really be said in the same sentence together, but anyway, I'm glad you could join me for this video. Please do check out my Patreon page if you can, where I post monthly written tutorials, each illustrated with over 100 photos to guide you through diorama builds not featured on my YouTube channel. Anyway, until next time, take care all, and cheerio!